who were not rich could receive quality care. These are corporations. This is big business. Even the ones affiliated to universities, they are corporations and they are big business. And so when corporations go behind closed doors with grieving family members, there's no real accountability that takes place. And so I just want to talk about it and bring it to light and put it in, just put it in the consciousness. And my goal is that in having and sharing this conversation is that you will be better equipped yourself if and when, and hopefully it never happens, but if and when you find yourself in a situation like this, that you will feel empowered enough to keep your voice loud and strong. And when I say keep your voice loud and strong, I mean act a damn fool if that's what you have to do. I'm not playing with y'all today. So into the main story. Let's talk about it. The main story is, it's actually my own story in a situation like this. And, I shared with you all that I grew up in the military system, and in the military system, it's very basic. It works like universal health care. I mean, it truly is universal health care. Everyone in the military gets taken care of, point blank and period. You're in the military, you get sick, you go to the clinic, you go to the hospital. There is an insurance plan, and that's there, but that does not, no one is denied healthcare. Nobody. And so my entire life, I grew up knowing that if we got sick or if somebody was especially ill, I had a brother who had asthma. As he got it as a baby. And there was never, ever, ever, ever a time that my parents had to fret about how much they had to pay the doctor. There was never, ever a time that they had to fret about whether they could afford the medication that he needed. There was never a time that they had to worry about not being able to go to the emergency room because that copay is so much more ridiculous than waiting until, the next day to see your own doctor. And so that was the frame of reference that I had for medicine growing up. And then once I became a nurse and I was working in the civilian sector, I saw the dramatic change. When I first started working as a civilian, I was actually still working in the military system. That's what I told you in episode 2. The same hospital that my son was born in was the Army hospital at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So even once I got out of the military, my husband was still in, and my husband at the time, we, nothing changed for us. But then we moved to New York City, and I took a job as a nurse in New York City, and that was when I first started working in women's health, which I absolutely loved it. I started and I was just like, where have I been my whole life? This is the work I want to do. Prior to working in women's services, I'd done a little bit of everything. I was working per diem, and I had worked in nursing homes. I'd worked as a private, a home health pediatric nurse. And so I took care of babies that were born premature, and they had trachs. And so they needed 24/7 care at home. And then I even did a little bit of, when I was working at the Army hospital, when I took that job, I was working on a medical surgical / telemetry unit. And so I'd done all this other work, and the work was somewhat fulfilling, but I just knew, I was just like, this isn't, every time I took on one of those jobs, like, this isn't it. And then I got to New York City, and I accepted a position as a nurse at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital. We were at the Roosevelt Hospital side, and I worked in private practice OBGYN for a couple of urogynecologists. But they shared office space with other doctors who were OB obstetricians as well. And so, that's how I got my start. But that's when I started to learn about the huge disparities that there are in healthcare, especially when we're talking about rich versus poor, especially when we're talking about women of color, especially when we're talking about Black women. And so those are the facts. It is what it is. I don't care to break down numbers to you because I'm talking about human beings today. That's how we get down on the Intercultured with Anya Dula podcast. All right. So I was working as a nurse in OBGYN with St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital. And at the point that this story begins, I had been working with them for 2 or 3 years. And actually, I wasn't even at Roosevelt Hospital anymore. I had left that job and I'd gotten a job as a nurse supervisor for a different group. But so the St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital fell under this umbrella of basically a corporation that had several hospitals under it. And so my family lived in Brooklyn at the time, myself, my ex-husband, and our 2 boys. And the hospital system that I worked for, both of them, the hospital, St. Luke's Roosevelt, and then the other one that I eventually transferred to, they were in Manhattan. And so I chose the sister hospital that was in Brooklyn as the hospital that was our family hospital. So our primary care providers and everybody was at that hospital for obvious reasons. When you have kids, and my kids went to school in Brooklyn, and my ex-husband at the time, he worked nights, so he was home during the day. And if they had, doctor's appointments, so on and so forth, well, we trusted the pediatrician that we had there in Brooklyn. And anytime my children needed care, and it wasn't even my children because Jahari was always fine. Bryce, on the other hand, always had an injury. It is a wonder that at no point the emergency room didn't like put a CPS case on us because he was a frequent flyer emergency room kid, okay? He was just always hurt, always into something. There was just always something going on with him. But so that was the hospital we trusted. And so when I had this very scary experience, it was a no-brainer to me to go to that hospital as opposed to me going into Manhattan to go to the actual hospital that I worked at, because our experience had always been great at this hospital. So this is what happened. It's a Friday night. I get off work and I was taking an exercise. It was a belly dance class. Just to give you a picture of who I was when I was living in New York City. Okay. I was like, I'm going to live this life. Like, we going to live New York City up. So I was Friday night, got off work, went to my belly dance class. Everything was normal. I had a great day, had a great workout session. On my way home, and when I'm on the subway, I think my subway ride at that time was probably like 35, 40 minutes at that time in the evening. Like rush hour was a different story, but it was probably about 35, 40 minutes. And so I'm on the train in my workout clothes. My hair is disheveled. I'm sweaty. I probably looked a hot mess, like hot, but like, ooh, girl, you hot. But I was probably a hot mess. So anyway, we get into Brooklyn, and one stop prior to the stop that I got off to get home, which was actually on the street that I lived on, I stood up to make my way toward the door, and I felt this pop, and I didn't really know where the pop came from. I just know that it felt like kind of in my stomach area. I felt a pop, and then I went faint. And I am someone who I've never actually fainted in my life. Like one time I passed out, but I got hit by a basketball in a basketball game. But like to just faint, that's never happened. So I nearly fainted. And then I just was overcome with this rush of, I didn't know this feeling. I just knew it felt like doom, and I knew something was seriously wrong. And I knew I needed to get off this train. And so I was trying to hold my bearings until we got to the next stop. And then people around me they started realizing that something was wrong with me, that I was sick. And so they helped me off the train. They helped me up the stairs. And then someone took my cell phone so that they could call my husband. And so my husband came down the street and got me, and then we went to the ER because I was like, something's wrong. Like, I feel like I'm dying. I was in so much pain. Like that pain scale that that we're always asking, what's your scale? On a scale of 1 to 10, what's your pain level? I was on 25, 30, 40. Like, it was bad. It was awful. And I have a high pain tolerance. I told you guys I had my first baby with no issues, no epidural, no nothing. So we get to the hospital somewhere between about 6:30 or 7 o'clock. Get to the ER, check in with the nurse. I tell her I'm in pain. I am like physically unable to stand. My husband is holding me up. And then when I went to sit down, like I couldn't even sit down because it hurt so bad. Like my rectum I felt all this pain in my stomach and in my rectum. It was so intense. So I couldn't sit. I was literally, you guys, on the emergency room floor on all fours. So on my hands and knees, rocking. So the position that I now as a doula put my clients into, like that I suggest, will help. So that's what I was doing in the emergency room. And I can laugh about this now because this was way back in 2006. But at the time it was absolutely terrifying because I knew that I felt like I was slipping. And that's the best way I can describe it. It was like I knew that something was beyond seriously wrong. So I'm on my hands and knees on all fours. The ER is super busy, as most ERs are going to be around that time in the evening. And so I'm waiting, and I'm willing to wait, and I understand how hospitals work, and I understand that there's triage, and I understand that, these are the things that I know as a nurse. And I understand that, the blanket statement that all ERs like to say, well, if there's a gunshot victim or a stabbing victim, they're going to go before you, because I got it. I was like, all right, I'm chilling. I'm going to just rock back and forth. And I was crying, whatever. So there were a couple of times that my husband went back to check and ask, am I next or whatever? And they kept giving him that silly statement. And then he came back. And so it's going on probably 10 p.m. when I start to realize that the ER is thinning out. The waiting room is thinning out, and there are very few people that are still waiting. And so at this point, I take myself back to the nurse desk, and I ask, what's going on? Because this is awful. And that I could tell the nurse, I know nurse language. I know nurse eyes. I know the tilt of nurses' heads. And I knew that she either one thought that I was faking, or she thought that I was like some street girl, probably seeking drugs. And so, I'm trying to explain to her the amount of pain that I'm in. I'm trying to explain. I tell her that I'm a nurse, but she already knew that because they had my insurance card.